Dr. Justin Frank is on the line with us. He is the, now I've lost my page, psychoanalyst and clinical professor with the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at George Washington University, the author of Trump on the Couch, Obama on the Couch, Bush on the Couch. Justin Frank, MD, is his Twitter handle, which is really worth following. And Dr. Frank, welcome back to the program, and thank you for joining us for a full hour for Conversations Great Minds. I have a lot of questions for you. If I could start out, we just saw this victory in Virginia where Glenn Youngkin, ran against Terry McAuliffe. Terry McAuliffe, obviously not the most progressive or the most enthusiasm-generating candidate, but Youngkin basically was saying, I have no platform other than auditing the 2020 election. And one other thing, which is stopping the teaching of critical race theory in Virginia schools, which A, is not happening, and B, seems to me like just code for, we're no longer going to talk about race. What's the deal? What's the psychology? Why does the right hate education, number one? And number two, what's the psychology behind creating fear around critical race theory, and why is it such a potent force in America?
Well, first of all, hi.
Hi.
Second of all, creating fear is actually not exactly what's going on. It's tapping into fear that's already there. It's tapping into fear in our unconscious, and everybody has fear. We have different degrees and we have different subjects about which we're afraid. But when we were kids, we had night terrors that woke us up. We were afraid of the dark, afraid of all kinds of things. And as you grew up, there were phobias. People were afraid about what they would eat, be paranoid about this, be afraid of different things. And in fact, when the United States was founded, people were afraid of central government, which is why they had the Articles of Confederation. And then people were afraid of states having too much power. But it was about a fear of being taken advantage of. It's a fear that that something's going to be out of your control. So in some ways, the topic of the fear doesn't matter as much as the fear, the process of the fear. That's the first thing. So Youngkin tapped into a fear that has to do with race, that has to do with a fear that people are going to become, white people are going to become ashamed and embarrassed that they have white skin, that they're going to come home. And I've had some patients actually whose kids have come home who told me in sessions years ago, as one little girl came home to her mom, and she came in and said that she's 9 years old and she's ashamed of being white. And she feels embarrassed about it and ashamed of it. And so there's some anxieties about it. But as far as Youngkin is concerned, critical race theory is an interesting thing because it is not taught in the schools in Virginia. It is taught in the advanced law schools and things. So it's not a subject that doesn't exist. But the issue is really what McAuliffe said that was so problematic was he said that parents can't tell the teachers what to teach. And that taps into a very serious issue about fear, about control, about parental power, and actually about exercising that power when you're actually discounting the expertise of teachers. And I have a family member who's a teacher in New Jersey, and she said Christie was the governor. He set teachers against parents, and it was awful. And she's worried that that's going to happen in Virginia. So, I don't know what else.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
So are you suggesting that Terry McAuliffe, by making that statement, which got amplified a million times by the Youngkin campaign, basically shot himself in the foot more than, it was more a bad McAuliffe strategy than a good Youngkin strategy?
Yes, it was a bad McAuliffe strategy because it was used as a soundbite that they just plastered everywhere. I mean, it was a one simple statement. So I mean, it was like he was either unschooled or he didn't, quite get what a hot button issue that is.
Right.
Because teachers, I mean, I remember growing up in Los Angeles, they wouldn't allow us to learn about UNESCO, United Nations Education, Scientific Cultural Organization. They wouldn't allow it to be taught in the LA public school system because if you learned about other countries, you would forget about your own. That's oversimplifying it, but that's how it was in the mid-'50s.
Well, there was also a big fear of the United Nations, too. I remember that
Fear
well.
of the United Nations, yes. And the hatred of the United Nations, and it was about fear. Mm-hmm. People were afraid. And I remember when I was a kid, my mother went to a PTA meeting, and she found herself speaking up about all of this because everybody was attacking the UN. And she said, wait a minute. I have a child in the 4th grade, and I think he should learn about the UN. And as the meeting ended, she was afraid to walk to her car because she might be attacked. And somebody came up to her and said, why are you wearing that red dress?
Wow.
Because red is the color of communists.
Right.
And then we got a letter in the mail because she made such a fuss about it. It was in the LA papers. There was a letter that came in the mail, and it said on the envelope, away with democracy, teach the Constitution in the schools. That's what it said in the upper left corner.
Wow.
I still have that letter.
So,
that's in the mid-'50s.
Yeah, so this is nothing new. Let's talk about the racial aspect of it for a moment. The lesson that the Republicans seem to have learned from Youngkin's victory was that if you yell and scream about critical race theory being taught in the schools, then Republicans turn out to vote. And
yes.
it seems to me like this really has nothing to do with critical race theory. It has everything to do with white Republicans being uncomfortable simply with the actual history of America being taught. Can you speak to that? What are the consequences of that? And how do you do it in a way that doesn't cause a 9-year-old, now you've got, the example you gave, a 9-year-old white girl coming home and saying, I'm ashamed of my skin. The opposite example I would offer would be, the 9-year-old black girl who's, the one of very, very few in an all-white school coming home and saying, I'm being persecuted because of the color of my skin. It's like, how do we try to race neutralize things, or is that even possible or desirable?
Well, one of the problems in teaching is that you have to remember that children see the world in terms of either or. They don't see things in complexity. So you're either white or you're black. You're either this or you're that. It's an all or nothing kind of phase in life. That's why kids are comparing who's the best baseball player or who's the best this. They can't think that both, I don't know what example it would be, 2 quarterbacks like Tom Brady and some other quarterback could both be great. Why do we have to have one that's the greatest? But that's how people think when they're in their 8, 9, 10 years old. So it can be about how they're educated and how they're taught in school. But what I think is important is that Republicans, white Republicans, are afraid of losing their world, which is a world that has been their world since slavery and since forever. And all of a sudden it seems, there are people who are very uncomfortable with diversity, and they feel that it's dangerous and it threatens them. And so they're afraid of otherness, of blacks, of Latinos, of all kinds of things. And fear is really a big thing, and racism. I mean, it's really hard to go into the whole thing about racism right now, but I do think that's what motivates a lot of Republicans. Yeah. However, I think a lot of black voters didn't turn up to vote in Virginia. In other words, I think there's a baseline of Republican white voters who are going to come out, whether it's Youngkin or Trump. The question is how many other voters are going to come out on the Democratic side. And I think that a lot of the black voters who voted for Biden have felt let down.
Yeah.
Disappointed.
I have,
and they didn't show up.
I have heard that on this program. It'd be interesting to do an analysis of the vote. Pull race out of the equation for a moment. As you pointed out, back in the 1950s, the whole Republican freakout was about teaching about the United Nations in our schools,
yes.
which is not a racial issue. I suppose you could argue, most of the world isn't Caucasian, but still, I don't think it was a racial issue as much as it was. The demagoguery of,
the Red Scare.
There you go.
Communists, about Russia, about taking away our rights and our freedoms.
Right. So why is it that when these kinds of issues come up, people on the right target education? Is it that point you were making earlier that parents? Well, let me just make it open. Why is it?
Well, education is the molding of children. So parents want their children molded in their own image. And if their own image is one of the only way to be safe is to be all white, or to have no communists under your bed, or no black people under your bed, depending on what decade you're talking about, whether it's the 50s or this decade. As long as there's somebody who's not dangerous around, that's the goal. And education has to do with certain values and that they think are important, but that unconsciously there is a hatred of reality always, because the problem with material external reality is it forces people to have to think and make choices and do work. Thinking is work. I love talking with you, Tom, because you help me think. But I also know that I was nervous before I come on your show because I know I'm going to have to work hard to try to make sense of the things we're talking about better. And thinking is work. The parents want things that are pat, that are memorized, that the children will learn to be like them. They really have a problem tolerating their children's autonomy, their individuality, their separation, their growth. It is very hard for people to have children who grow up to be not at all like me, quote.
Is that
my favorite cartoon of one last thing, years ago when I was a younger guy, it was in the New Yorker, and there were these two hippies sitting on the floor smoking whatever they were smoking with long hair, husband and wife, and there was a little kid walking in between the two of them carrying a briefcase and a suit. He was about 5 years old, and they looked at each other and they said, "Where did we go wrong?"
Right. And welcome back. We're talking with Dr. Justin Frank, psychoanalyst, psychiatrist, clinical professor of psychiatry at George Washington, author of Trump on the Couch, Bush on the Couch, Obama on the Couch. Hopefully one of these days, Biden on the couch. Are you working on that?
Well, I've decided to work on something more ambitious, which is something that's akin to America on the Couch. Because Biden is an amazing person, and I could do that, but I think I've done enough with individuals. If I were going to summarize Biden on the couch, though, I could do it in one sentence that's very clear to me, which is that sorrow is the vitamin of growth and strength.
You know, it has often occurred to me that many of the people I've known in the healing professions are themselves deeply wounded, particularly in the areas that they particularly work. And I have always thought that Joe Biden was quite literally the wounded healer.
Yes, I agree with that completely.
So back to our conversation we were having a moment ago about right-wing opposition to education. Robert Altmaier wrote a book called The Authoritarians about a decade and a half ago. John Dean, in fact, wrote a book called Conservatives Without Conscience based on Altmaier's book, and then he more recently wrote a book with Altmaier about this topic. And Altmaier's proposal or proposition is that about 20% of us in any human population are authoritarian-leaning kinds of folks. Just do it my way, damn it. And that those kind of folks, and then John Dean takes that and says those kind of folks are the ones who show up in the Republican Party generally, and only rarely in the Democratic Party. Does that tell us, if that's true, does that tell us that this education issue, you know, we want our kids to grow up to be nice little robots who respect our values and nobody else's, is something that would really resonate well for Republicans, but for Democrats would be a relatively meaningless argument?
Well, that's a very, it's a bit of a polarizing question, although I do get what you're talking about. I think that everybody has some yearnings for an authoritarian leader, but I think Democrats are able to put those yearnings into perspective so they won't necessarily fall for it. But I do think that people do have yearnings for it. In fact, when Roosevelt was elected, during the time between his election and inauguration, which was a longer time than it is now, until March 4th, there were lots of people who wanted him to become a benevolent dictator, including Ickes and a couple of other advisors. I'm going to sneeze in a second. And excuse me. And
Bless you.
Thank you. And that he said, absolutely not. I want to be pushed by the people, and I want the people to push me. And that was how Roosevelt understood that yearning. People have that yearning. The Republicans take advantage of that yearning, and they do attract people who are much more clear about wanting to follow the leader, the leader. So one of the things that I notice as a psychoanalyst, just individually, is that a lot of people give me more credit than I should have in my office because I'm the expert on their unconscious. I know more about them sometimes than they feel they know about themselves, and that's just not true. I know certain things that they may not have thought about, but they give me a level of expertise that is not quite fair. But there is a yearning for an authoritarian figure to tell them what to do, to tell them, do not be afraid, I will take care of things.
It's like we're all little kids deep down inside.
We all were.
Yeah.
We aren't now only, but we were all of us.